The notice went up on the church door on a grey morning in the 3rd week of November, and every soul in the parish of Maron Cross read it before noon. It was written in a fine hand, too fine for the crabbed old sexton who usually posted such things, and it announced that Miss Eleanor Whitby, ward of Mr. Silas Grote of Grote Hall, was to be given in marriage before the month was out. It is named no groom. That absence was the thing the village chewed on, the way a dog worries a bone with no meat left on it, and by evening. There was not a hearth in Maron Cross where the matter had not been turned over twice. Eleanor herself had not seen the notice. She learned of it from the baker's daughter, who came to the kitchen door of Grote Hall with a basket of loaves and a face bright with the pleasure of carrying bad news to the one it concerned. Eleanor took the bread and thanked her, and said nothing that could be repeated, for she had learned long ago that anything she said in that house travelled back to her uncle by nightfall. But her hands were cold when she carried the loaves inside, and the cold had nothing to do with November. She was 23 that autumn, and she had lived beneath her uncle's roof for 11 years, since the winter both her parents were taken by the fever that swept the Low Country, and left her an orphan with a small inheritance and no protector but the law. The inheritance was the reason she still ate at Grote Hall. Her uncle had been named the keeper of it until she married or came of a certain age, and Silas Grote was not a man to let a coin pass out of his hands without first squeezing it to see what more it might yield. Eleanor had understood this by the time she was 15. She had understood a great many things by then. Grote Hall was a heavy house, built by men who valued weight over grace, and it sat in a fold of the moor, where the wind found it from 3 sides, and rattled the old casements all winter long. There was money enough in the family for the house to have been kept warm and bright, but her uncle did not believe in fires before December, nor candles where a rushlight would serve, so Eleanor had grown used to cold rooms and long shadows, and to the particular silence of a place where no one laughed without a reason, and the reasons were few. She kept to the kitchen and the still room and the walled garden when the weather allowed, and she made herself useful, because usefulness was a kind of shield, and a girl with no dowry she could touch. And no friend who could stand against her guardian learned early to hold whatever shield she could. The marriage her uncle intended was not a kindness. Eleanor knew that the way she knew the turn of the seasons. For 11 years he had kept her unwed, refusing every quiet inquiry from the few respectable families who might have taken her, because an unmarried ward was an inheritance he still controlled, and a married one was a purse he must open. Something had changed. She did not yet know what, but the notice on the church door told her that her uncle had at last found a way to marry her off and keep the money both, and that meant the man he had chosen was a man of his own kind, a man who would take a wife with empty hands and be content because some other bargain had been struck beneath the table where she could not see it. She found out the shape of it 2 days later, when her uncle called her into the cold parlour and told her without once meeting her eyes that she was to be married on the last Saturday of the month to a man named Adam Thorne. She had never heard the name. Her uncle said the man was a newcomer to the district, a fellow of no particular family who had come north looking for work and lodging and had proved willing. Willing, her uncle said, was the great virtue in a husband, and Eleanor should be grateful to have found one, for a girl in her position could hardly expect a gentleman. Eleanor stood very still and asked what the man did for a living. Her uncle said it did not signify. She asked whether she might meet him before the day. Her uncle said she would meet him at the altar and not before, and that any objection she cared to raise would be noted and disregarded, and that she might go now. She went. She climbed the back stairs to her cold little room under the eaves, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not weep, because weeping had never once in 11 years changed a single thing her uncle had decided, and she had given it up as a childish habit long ago. But she thought all that night and into the pale hours before dawn, and what she thought was this. A husband, even a poor one, even a stranger, was a man the law would set above her uncle. Once she was wed, Silas Grote was no longer her guardian. Her inheritance, whatever remained of it after 11 years of his keeping, would pass into her marriage, and a husband who was willing might also be willing to be honest, or at least willing to be kind, which was more than she had known under this roof. She did not fool herself that she was being rescued. She understood that she was being sold. But there is a difference between being sold to a jailer and being sold to a stranger who might, by some small mercy, open a door instead of locking one, and Eleanor had learned to measure her hopes in differences that small. Her mother was much in her thoughts that week, as her mother always was at the turnings of her life. Margaret Whitby had been a gentle woman of good family and small fortune, and she had married for love a man of even smaller fortune, and the two of them had made, for the few short years the fever left them, a home so warm in Eleanor's memory that she sometimes wondered whether she had invented the warmth to survive the cold that came after. There had been a story her mother told, half a story really, of a great kindness done and a greater one owed, of a family of rank who had wronged the Whitbys long ago and never made it right, and her mother had told it without bitterness as a thing that belonged to the past and could not be mended. Eleanor had not thought of it in years. She thought of it now only because a girl about to be married thinks of her mother, and wishes her mother living, and wonders what her mother would have made of the strange poor stranger waiting at the end of the week. She could not have guessed that the half-remembered story of an old wrong was the very thread that had drawn the stranger north, nor that her mother, dead these 11 years, had reached out of the grave in the only way the dead can reach, through a letter left unsent in a dead man's papers, to set in motion the rescue of a daughter she had not lived to protect. Eleanor knew none of this. She knew only that she was cold, and that she was to be married, and that she wished her mother were there. So she did not fight the marriage. She let the last week of November close around her like a hand, and she sewed the one good gown she owned into something a shade less plain, and she waited to meet the man whose name she had been given. The man himself came to Maron Cross on foot, which the whole village remarked, for a groom with any means at all would have come on a horse. He took a room above the smithy, and paid for it in coin that was sound, but not plentiful, and he kept to himself, and he was civil to everyone and familiar with no one. He was tall, and he was younger than the village had expected, perhaps 30, and he had the sort of hands that had done work, though there was something in the way he carried his head that did not match the plainness of his coat. The smith's wife said he spoke like a man who had been to better schools than his boots suggested. The sexton said he asked questions about the district that a labourer would have no cause to ask. But a man's manner is his own affair, and if Adam Thorne chose to walk north with little money and marry a guardian's unwanted ward, that was between him and his reasons, and the village let it be. What the village did not know, and what Eleanor did not know, and what her uncle least of all suspected, was that the man calling himself Adam Thorne had another name, and that the coat he wore had been chosen precisely because it was plain. He had come north not to find work, but to find a woman he had never met, and he had let himself be drawn into this marriage not out of poverty, but out of a purpose he had told to no living soul in the county. His name, the one written in the register of a far grander parish 200 miles to the south, was Adam Charteris, and he was the 4th Duke of Ellesmere, and he was hiding, and this cold marriage in a cold country was the deepest part of the place he had chosen to hide. He had his reasons, and they were old and heavy ones. His father, the 3rd Duke, had died 2 years before, and in dying had left behind not only the title and the estates, but a tangle of debts and rivals and hangers-on that had closed over the young Duke's life like water over a dropped stone. There had been a cousin who wanted the title, and would not scruple at much to get it. There had been a woman in London who had wanted the Duke, and when refused had set about ruining his name with a patience that frightened him more than any open enemy. There had been, at the last, a night when a man he trusted had warned him that his life itself might be worth less to certain parties than his death, and Adam Charteris, who was neither a coward nor a fool, had understood that a duke surrounded by servants and comforts was also a duke who could be watched, poisoned, cornered, and undone. So he had done a thing no one expected a duke to do. He had vanished. He had left his affairs in the hands of the one man in England he still trusted, an old lawyer named Pemberton, who had served his father and asked no questions he did not need answered. And he had put on a plain coat and walked out of his own life to see what it looked like from the outside. He had wanted, above all, to know which of the people around him valued the man and which valued only the coronet, and there was no way to learn that while he wore the coronet. A poor man among the poor sees the truth of people quickly. A duke sees only the reflection of his own rank in every face turned toward him. Why Maron Cross, and why this marriage, was a longer story, and it turned on a name. Among the papers his father had left was an old letter, unsent, addressed to a woman named Margaret Whitby, and in it the third duke had written of a debt of honour he had never repaid, and a wrong he had never set right. Adam had read that letter 100 times. Margaret Whitby was long dead, but she had left a daughter, and the daughter, according to Pemberton's patient inquiries, was a girl named Eleanor, kept as an unpaid drudge by a grasping uncle in a hard parish on the northern moors. Adam had come north meaning only to see the girl, to judge whether the debt his father had confessed was one he ought to honour, and to settle something on her quietly if she proved deserving. He had not meant to marry her, but when he came to Maron Cross and let it be known he was a man without means seeking lodging and work, Silas Grote had found him within a week, and made him an offer that told Adam everything he needed to know about the life Eleanor Whitby had been living. Grote had offered him money to marry the girl and sign away. In a private paper, all claim to her inheritance. The uncle meant to keep the money and be rid of the ward, and have a compliant fool of a husband sign the proof of it. Adam had listened to this offer with a face like stone, and inside he had felt something he had not felt in the 2 years since his father died, which was a clean and simple anger. He had agreed. He had agreed to every term, and taken the uncle's grubby coin, and let the man believe he had found the perfect dupe, because Adam had seen in an instant that the fastest way to lift Eleanor Whitby out of that house was to be the husband the law placed above her uncle, and the fastest way to become that husband was to let Silas Grote think he had won. What Grote did not know was that the paper he would have his willing groom sign was worth nothing against a duke, that the money Adam took was less than the duke spent on candles in a week, and that the moment the marriage was made, every particle of power Silas Grote held over his niece would turn to ash in his hands. But all of this Adam kept behind his plain coat and his quiet manner, and so on the last Saturday of November, Eleanor Whitby walked to the church on the arm of a man she did not know, believing she was marrying a penniless stranger, and the penniless stranger was a duke, and neither the bride nor the guardian nor the whole watching village knew the truth of the man at the altar. The wedding was a poor cold thing as her uncle had intended. There were no flowers and no feast and no gathering of friends, for Eleanor had few friends and her uncle had invited none of them. The church was nearly empty. The curate read the words quickly, his breath showing in the cold air, and Eleanor stood beside the tall stranger and made her answers in a steady voice. And she looked at him only once, when the curate asked whether she would take this man, and found him already looking at her with an expression she could not read. It was not the greedy look she had feared, nor the indifferent one. It was something closer to gravity, as though the moment weighed on him more than she had any reason to expect it should. And it unsettled her, because she had prepared herself for a fool or a brute, and had not prepared herself for a man whose eyes seemed to be asking her forgiveness for something he had not yet done. When it was over, her uncle did not linger. He shook the groom's hand with the brisk satisfaction of a man closing a sale, and he reminded him, in a low voice, he did not trouble to lower quite enough about the paper that was to be signed. Then he went back to Grota Hall without a word to his niece, and Eleanor understood that she had passed out of his house and his keeping in the space of a quarter hour, and that whatever came next, she would not sleep beneath that cold roof again. She stood in the churchyard in her made-over gown, with a ring of thin gold on her finger, and a husband she had met at the altar, and she felt the strangest lightness, as though a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten its shape had been set down without her leave. They walked back toward the village together, the two of them, in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite otherwise. It was Eleanor who broke it, because she had decided some time in the sleepless nights before that she would not begin her marriage as she had spent her girlhood, holding her tongue and waiting to be told. She asked him plainly whether the money her uncle had given him was the whole of the reason he had married her. She would rather know the worst of it at the start, she told him, than discover it slowly across a lifetime. He was quiet for a few steps. Then he told her, which surprised her, that the money was not the reason, though he did not yet tell her what the reason was. He told her only that he had come to Maron Cross for her sake and not her uncle's, and that she need not fear him, and that whatever she had been made to expect of this marriage she might set aside, for he intended her no harm and a good deal of the opposite. It was a strange speech from a poor stranger, and it did not answer her question, and yet there was a plainness in the way he offered it that she found herself, against all her hard-won caution, inclined to believe. She did not believe it wholly. She had believed too many small hopes into ruin to trust a stranger's word after a single walk. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything, and she watched him after that with a closer and more curious attention. He had taken, it transpired, a cottage at the edge of the village, a low stone place with 2 rooms and a good hearth, and he had made it ready before the wedding without a word to her, which touched her more than she wished to admit, for it meant he had thought of her comfort before he had any claim on her gratitude. There was a fire laid and lit when they came to it, and bread and cheese and a small cold fowl, and a jug of ale, and it was more warmth and more plenty than Eleanor had known in a single room of Grote Hall in 11 years. She stood in the doorway and looked at the fire, and something in her chest tightened so hard she had to turn her face away so the stranger would not see it. He saw it anyway. He was a man who saw a great deal, she would learn, and said little of what he saw. He did not remark on it. He set about the small business of laying out the food, and he gave her time to master herself, and when she turned back her face was composed, and he behaved as though it had never been otherwise. That, more than the fire or the food, was the first thing that made her think she might have been given, by whatever grace still troubled itself over girls like her, something better than she had any right to expect. The first weeks of the marriage were careful ones. They lived as strangers who have agreed to be kind, sharing the small cottage and the daily work of keeping it, learning each other by inches. He would not take from her what a husband was owed by law, and he told her so on the first night in words that were brief and left no room for shame on either side, and Eleanor, who had braced herself for that too, found the ground she had steeled herself to stand on simply removed. He slept in the outer room. She had the inner one with the door that closed. He asked nothing of her but her company at the table and her honesty, and he gave her in return a courtesy so steady and so free of calculation that she kept waiting for its price to be named, and the price was never named, and slowly. Without deciding to, she stopped waiting. He worked. That was another thing that unsettled the picture she had built of him. A man who had married for a guardian's coin might have been expected to idle on it, but Adam Thorne rose early and hired himself out to the farms along the valley, mending walls and cutting wood and turning his educated hands to rough labour with a will that puzzled the men who employed him. He was clumsy at first and then quickly not, and he never complained, and he brought home his wages and put them on the table where Eleanor could see them, and he asked her to keep the household purse, because to his mind She plainly had the better head for it. No one had ever suggested to Eleanor that she had the better head for anything. She took the purse and she kept it well, and she found in the keeping of it a small daily dignity that 11 years under her uncle had starved her of entirely. They talked, in the evenings, over the fire. At first about small things, the weather and the work and the doings of the village, and then, as the weeks drew on and the winter deepened, about larger ones. She learned that he had read a great many books, far more than a labourer had any business reading, and when she remarked on it, he grew guarded and turned the talk aside, and she noticed the guardedness and did not press it. She had her own silences and understood the right to keep them. But she began to build, from 100 small inconsistencies, a private conviction that Adam Thorne was not the simple poor man he claimed to be. His hands had learned their calluses recently. His speech, when he forgot to watch it, was the speech of a drawing-room, and not a smithy. He knew the names of wines and the manners of great houses, and the way a letter ought to be folded and sealed. And he knew them not as a servant knows them from the outside, but as a man knows the furniture of his own life. She said nothing. She watched, and she wondered, and she kept her wondering to herself. For his part, Adam had come north expecting to find a meek and broken girl, a creature so ground down by her uncle that there would be little left of her but obedience, and he had found instead Eleanor Whitby, who was quiet but not meek, who kept her own counsel the way he kept his, who had a dry and unexpected wit that surfaced when she forgot to guard it, and who had somehow through 11 years of cold and contempt kept a core of herself intact and unbowed. He had married her to save her. He had not counted on coming to admire her, and then on the admiration deepening into something he had no plain word for, and did not examine too closely. Because to examine it was to reckon with the lie at the centre of their marriage, and he was not yet ready to reckon with that. For there was the difficulty, and it grew heavier with every honest evening by the fire. He had built his marriage on a concealment. Every day that he let her go on believing him a poor stranger was a day he deceived a woman who had shown him nothing but a hard-won and reluctant trust, and the better he came to know her, the more the deception galled him. He told himself he kept the secret for her safety, and there was truth in that, for the enemies he had fled in the south were real, and a duke's wife was a target as surely as a duke, and Eleanor knew nothing of the danger she would inherit the moment she learned whose wife she was. But he knew, in the honest hours after she had gone to her room and he lay awake before the banked fire, that safety was only half his reason. The other half was baser and simpler. He was afraid that when she learnt the truth she would see, not the man she had come to sit with by the fire, but the coronet, and that the clear regard she gave him now, given to Adam Thorne the poor labourer, would curdle into the wary calculation he had seen on every face in his old life. He had married her partly to be loved as a man, and not a rank. To tell her the truth was to risk losing the very thing the lie had let him have. There was a morning, early in December, when she woke to find him already gone out into the dark before the light, and came down to a fire built and a kettle set near the coals, so that the room would be warm, before she rose. She stood in the cold grey of the outer room and looked at the small, careful evidence of a man who had thought of her comfort while she slept, and she could not remember the last time anyone had done a kind thing for her that no one would ever see or praise. Her uncle's house had run on account and obligation, every service weighed and every kindness owed. This was something else. This was a thing done freely and left unmentioned, and it undid her more thoroughly than any grand gift could have, because it asked nothing back. She began, without deciding to do such things for him in return. She mended the frayed cuff of his one good shirt while he slept and said nothing of it, and watched him find it in the morning, and turn it over and say nothing either. And something passed between them in that double silence that was warmer than speech. She learned the food he favoured, and made it without announcement. She kept the lamp trimmed, and the hearth swept, and the small poor rooms as bright as poor rooms could be made, not because it was owed, but because she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she wished to. She had spent 11 years making a cold house bearable for a man who despised her. It was a strange and healing thing to spend her care on a man who noticed it and gave it back. He told her about books, on the long evenings, and this was the thing that most nearly undid his careful concealment, for a labourer does not speak of books the way Adam Thorne spoke of them. He forgot himself in the telling. He described the great libraries of houses she would never see, the smell of old leather and the hush of high shelves, and then would catch himself and turn the subject roughly aside, and Eleanor would watch the shutter come down over his face and wonder anew what manner of man she had married. She asked him once, gently, how a poor labourer came to know such places. He was quiet a long moment, looking into the fire, and then he told her only that he had been a servant once in a great house, which was not a lie exactly, for a duke is in his way a servant of his name, and she let it pass because she saw it cost him something to say even that much, and she had never been a woman to press on a wound. The winter closed hard over the moor. The snow came in the second week of December and did not go, and the valley drew into itself, and the small cottage at the edge of Maron Cross became a warm and lamplit island in a white and silent country. They were much alone together in those weeks, and the enforced closeness did what such closeness does. The carefulness between them wore thinner. They laughed more easily. Once, reaching for the same cut of bread, their hands met over the board and neither drew back at once, and the small ordinary contact hung in the firelight a heartbeat longer than it needed to, and both of them felt it, and neither of them spoke of it. And afterward, Eleanor lay awake in the inner room and pressed her cold hand against her own cheek, and did not know what to make of the warmth in it. She had not meant to come to care for him. Caring was a risk she had sworn off, for in her experience the things she cared for were taken from her or turned against her, and it was safer to want nothing and expect less. But the man was hard not to care for. He was kind without wanting thanks for it. He was strong without using his strength to make her small. He noticed when she was tired and took the heavy work from her without making a show of it, and he asked her opinion and listened to the answer, and he had a way of looking at her, sometimes across the fire, that made her feel seen in a manner she had not been seen since her mother died. She began to be happy, which frightened her more than any misery ever had, because misery she knew how to survive and happiness she did not, and every happy hour felt borrowed against a debt she was sure would one day be called in. The debt began to be called in on a hard bright day in January, and it was her uncle who called it. Silas Grote had not, it turned out, forgotten his niece the moment she left his house. He had merely been waiting, as such men wait, for the terms of his bargain to be completed, and when weeks passed and the poor groom did not come to sign the private paper surrendering all claim to Eleanor's inheritance, the uncle grew first impatient and then suspicious. He rode down to Maron Cross himself, on the good horse he kept and never lent, and he came to the cottage while Adam was away at the far end of the valley mending a wall, and he found Eleanor alone. What passed between them was ugly. Her uncle had come meaning to bully the groom, and finding only the ward, he turned the full weight of his temper on her instead. He told her the marriage was a sham built on a paper her fool of a husband had not had the wit to sign, and that until it was signed the money remained his, and that if the husband would not sign it he, Grote, would find a way to have the marriage set aside, for a union made on false pretences by a vagrant of no family could surely be undone by a man with money and lawyers and patience. He told her she was still, in every way that counted, in his power, and that she had been a fool to think a scrap of gold on her finger had bought her free of him. And he told her, with the particular cruelty of a man who wants to see a thing break, that her precious husband had married her for the coin Grote had paid him, and for nothing else, and that the moment the money ran out she would see the truth of what she had wed. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her small warm cottage and let the words come, and the frightening thing was that some of them landed. She did not believe her uncle meant her well. She had never in 11 years known him to speak a word that was not bent to his own advantage. And she knew that everything he said now was said to wound and to reclaim, and yet knowing the poison did not wholly stop it working. For he had named the one fear she had never quite laid to rest, the fear that Adam's kindness was a performance with a price behind it, the fear that had lain coiled beneath every happy hour of the winter, whispering that happiness was borrowed, and the debt would come due. She had thought she had reasoned her way past that fear. She found now that she had only buried it, and that her uncle, with the unerring cruelty of a man who knows where the old wounds lie, had dug straight down to it and pulled it up into the light. The worst of it was the paper. She had not known there was a paper. She had not known that her marriage had a condition attached to it that her husband had agreed to and never mentioned. And the not knowing was a small cold door opening onto a room full of other things she might not know. If he had kept the paper from her, what else had he kept? If the marriage rested on a bargain struck in secret between her husband and the uncle she despised, then the warmth of the winter was built on a foundation she could not see and had not been permitted to examine. And hearing it spoken aloud by a man who knew the terms shook the fragile trust she had been so cautiously building. She sent her uncle away. She stood in the door until his horse was gone over the white rise of the moor, and then she went inside and sat by the fire that Adam had built that morning before he left, and she found that she was cold again, cold in the old deep way she had almost forgotten, and she did not know any longer what she believed. When Adam came home at dusk, he saw at once that something had broken. He had learned her face by then, its small closings and openings, and he saw it closed against him in a way it had not been since the first careful days, and he asked her what had happened, and she told him. She told him her uncle had come, and all of what her uncle had spoken, the paper and the money and the marriage that might be set aside, and she watched his face while she laid it out, looking for the guilt that would confirm the worst. And she saw, not guilt exactly, but something worse for her hopes, which was that none of it appeared to surprise him. He had known about the paper. He had known about the money. He stood there in the firelight having plainly known, and had told her none of it, and Eleanor felt the ground she had let herself begin to stand on shift once more beneath her feet. She asked him then, straight out, whether he had married her for her uncle's money, and Adam, who had sworn to himself 100 times that he would tell her the truth when the moment came, and had let 100 moments pass, found the true moment upon him at last, and was not ready, and hesitated, and the hesitation was its own answer to a woman who had learned to read silences. She turned away from him. In a low and steady voice that was worse than any weeping, she told him that she had known better than to hope, and that she had only herself to blame for forgetting it, and that he need not trouble to explain, for she had been sold all her life and had merely mistaken this last sale for something else. And she went into the inner room and closed the door. And Adam stood alone in the outer room before the fire he had built, and understood that his concealment had done, at last, exactly the harm he had told himself it would prevent. The inner door stayed closed all that evening, and the cottage that had grown so warm across the winter turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Adam did not knock. He understood that he had no right to knock, that a man who has withheld the truth cannot demand to be heard the moment the withholding is found out, and so he let her have the closed door she had earned and sat alone with the ruin of his own making. He could hear her, once moving in the inner room, and then nothing, and the nothing was worse than the moving had been. He thought of all the moments he might have told her and had not. The walk from the wedding, when she had asked him plainly, and he had answered in half-truths. The first night, when he might have laid the whole of it before her and trusted her to hold it. 100 evenings by the fire when the truth had risen in his throat and he had swallowed it back down out of the low fear that had governed him since his father died. the fear of being seen and found wanting, the fear that the regard she gave to Adam Thorne would not survive the naming of the Duke. He had told himself the fear was prudence. He saw now that it had only ever been cowardice wearing prudence like a plain coat, and that the disguise had fooled no one so thoroughly as it had fooled himself. He did not sleep. He sat by the fire the whole night through, and somewhere in the cold hours he came to the end of his long evasion. He had told himself he kept the secret to keep her safe and to keep her regard, and he saw now that the secret had endangered the one thing and destroyed the other, and that a man who would not risk the truth had no business asking to be loved. He resolved to tell her everything in the morning, the whole of it, the title and the danger and the debt his father had left and the reason he had come, and to let her judge him with the full truth in her hands, whatever it cost him. He had come north to right an old wrong done to her mother, and he had done a fresh wrong to the daughter, and there was only one way he knew to set it right, and that was to stop hiding. But the morning brought her uncle back before Adam could speak, and this time Silas Grote did not come alone. He had spent the weeks since the wedding making inquiries of his own, for a suspicious man does not sit idle, and something in the bearing of the poor groom had nagged at him from the start, the fine hands and the finer speech, and the coin that was sound but strange. He had written letters, he had paid a man in the south to ask questions, and he had come to the cottage that January morning not to bully but to expose. For he believed he had discovered that his niece's husband was a fraud living under a false name, a criminal in hiding, and he meant to use the discovery to break the marriage and reclaim the money and see the impostor gaoled into the bargain. He brought with him the parish constable and a hard-faced man from the south, who had once been a footman in a great house, and he came to the door of the cottage in the bright cold morning and hammered on it and called out that he had come to unmask a liar. Adam opened the door. Eleanor came from the inner room at the noise, pale from her sleepless night, and stood behind him, and so it was that she was there to hear it, when her uncle, purple with triumph, declared to the constable and the village folk gathering in the lane that the man calling himself Adam Thorne was no labourer at all, but a swindler living under a stolen name. The hard-faced footman from the south was brought forward to confirm it, to name the fraud, and the man looked at Adam's face in the clear morning light, and something happened that Silas Grote had not planned for. The footman went white. He snatched off his hat, and he bowed, low and shaking, and named the man in the doorway, not as a swindler, but as his Grace the Duke of Ellesmere, whom he had served bread and wine to in the great house in the south, and would know among 10,000. The lane went silent. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her small stone cottage in the hard January light, and she watched a footman she had never seen bow to the man she had married as a penniless stranger. And she heard the word Duke fall into the frozen morning, and she understood, all at once and far too late, why his hands had learnt their calluses so recently, and why his speech slipped so often into the cadence of great rooms, and why he had looked at her at the altar as though asking forgiveness for something he had not yet done. Her uncle's triumph collapsed into confusion, and then into a dawning, sickly fear, for a man who has cheated and threatened and schemed to rob a ward of her inheritance is in a very different position when the ward's husband turns out to be a duke, and Silas Grote saw his whole design turn in his hands and become the instrument of his own ruin. Adam did not look at the uncle. He did not look at the constable or the gaping village or the shaking footman. He looked at Eleanor, and the mask was off him now, the plain stranger gone, and what stood in its place was a man of rank and gravity who had, none the less, built her fire every morning and put his wages on her table and slept in the cold outer room so that she might have a door that closed. He spoke her name. He spoke it quietly, in the drawing-room voice he had tried so long to hide, and he told her, there in the doorway before all of them, that it was true, that he was the Duke of Ellesmere, that he had come north in a plain coat to find the daughter of a woman his father had wronged, and that he had married her to lift her out of her uncle's house, and had then, to his own undoing, come to love her as a man loves, and not as a duke bestows, and that he had kept the truth from her out of fear, the low fear that she would see the coronet and stop seeing the man, and that he had been a coward and was ashamed of it and asked, not her forgiveness, which he had not earned, but only her leave to explain. Eleanor heard him out in silence. The lane held its breath, and when he had finished she did not fall into his arms, for she was not a woman made of the stuff that falls into arms, and 11 years of cold had taught her to move slowly toward warmth. But she looked at him, at this stranger, who was a duke, who was, underneath all of it, the man who had noticed when she was tired and taken the heavy work from her hands, and she found that the thing she had been most afraid of did not happen. She did not stop seeing the man. The coronet was a fact, large and strange and frightening, that it sat on the outside of him, and inside it was still Adam who had built her fire, and she discovered in that moment that she had come to love the man, and that the rank did not undo it, but only made it more astonishing that such a man had chosen to build her fire at all. Some part of her, the wary part that 11 years had built and armoured, wanted to hold back, to weigh this astonishing turn as she had learned to weigh every turn, looking for the catch beneath it. A duke, the word ought to have frightened her, and in a way it did, for she knew enough of the world to know that a duchess was a target and a spectacle, and a thing hedged round with duties she could not yet imagine. But standing there in the doorway she found that the fear was distant and thin, and the thing that was near and warm and certain was the memory of a kettle set near the coals in the dark, of a mended cuff and a swept hearth, and a man who slept in the cold so that she might have a door that closed. The rank was true. But the rank was not the man, and she had learnt the man across a whole slow winter, and no revelation in a frozen lane could unteach her what her own eyes had spent 3 months learning. She crossed the small space of the doorway to him. She did not speak, for there were too many watching and the words she had were not for them. She put her hand in his, the hand that had learned its calluses on the farms along the valley, and she stood beside him and turned her face to her uncle, and in that simple movement the whole balance of 11 years turned over. Silas Grote looked at his niece standing hand in hand with a duke, and he understood that every thread of power he had held over her was cut, that the money he had schemed to keep would be counted to the last coin by a duke's lawyers, that the marriage he had meant to break was the strongest marriage in the county, and that he had, with his own suspicious hands, dragged the truth into the light and destroyed himself with it. He did not bluster. Even he could see the ruin of his position. He turned his good horse and rode away over the white moor, and he did not come back, and the reckoning that followed him was quiet and thorough and entirely lawful, and Eleanor never had to lift her hand against him, for the law that had bound her so long to his keeping now stood, at last, on her side. The village of Maron Cross talked of that morning for a generation, but the talk that mattered least was in the lane, and the talk that mattered most happened afterward, in the small warm cottage, when the crowd had gone, and the constable had gone, and the footman had been sent away with coin and thanks, and Eleanor and Adam were alone again by the fire as they had been on 100 quieter evenings. There was a great deal to say, and they said it slowly. He told her the whole of it, the debts and the rivals and the woman in London and the night he had understood his life was worth less to certain men than his death, and the letter his father had left, unsent, confessing a wrong done to a woman named Margaret Whitby. He told her that her mother's name had brought him north, and that he had come meaning only to settle a debt of conscience, and had found instead the woman he had not known he was looking for. And Eleanor, hearing the whole shape of it at last, understood that the thread of an old wrong done in her mother's time had reached across the years to lift her out of a cold house, and that the world was stranger, and, once in a long while, kinder than she had let herself believe. She asked him, because she was honest, and would begin the true part of her marriage as honestly as she had begun the false, whether he was sorry to have married a guardian's unwanted ward instead of the great lady a duke was meant to marry. And Adam took both her hands in his, the calloused hands that had built her fire, and he told her that he had spent 2 years surrounded by great ladies and false friends and men who valued the coronet above the man beneath it, and that he had walked out of all of it in a plain coat, precisely to find one person who would look at him and see a man, and that he had found her keeping a cold house on a hard moor, with her dignity unbroken and her heart unbought, and that he would not trade her for every great lady in England. The debt his father had left, he told her, was paid now, not in coin, but in the only true coin there is, and that if she would have him not as a duke offering rank, but as the man who had slept in her cold outer room to keep her safe, he would count himself the most fortunate man alive. Eleanor Whitby, who was now the Duchess of Ellesmere, and hardly knew yet what to do with the fact, looked at her husband across the fire he had built, and she thought of the 11 cold years and the notice on the church door and the walk from the wedding in the empty churchyard, and she thought of all the small mercies that had brought her, by a road she could never have foreseen, to a warm room and a good man and a life that was at last her own. She did not make him a grand answer, for she was not a woman of grand answers. She only tightened her hands in his, and she told him that she had married a penniless stranger to escape her uncle, and had never once, in all her careful reckoning, imagined she might have married a man she could love, and that of all the fortunes she had lost and been cheated of in her life, this was the one she had never dared to count on, and it was the only one that had ever mattered. They did not leave Maron Cross at once. There was the matter of the estates in the south, and the rivals to be faced, and the woman in London to be answered, and a duke cannot hide in a plain coat forever once the truth is out. But they faced all of it together, and they faced it as they had learned to face the long winter in the small cottage, side by side, sharing the work and the weight of it. And the enemies who had frightened Adam when he stood alone found him a different man when he stood with Eleanor beside him, for a man who has been truly seen and truly chosen is harder to break than a man who has only ever been envied. The cousin who wanted the title thought better of it. The woman in London found her poison had lost its power against a duke who no longer cared what she said, for the one person whose regard he wanted knew the truth of him entire, and gave her regard anyway. And in time the great house in the south, which had been for Adam a place of watching eyes and cold reflections, became something it had never been in his life before, which was a home, because Eleanor was in it. There was a conversation in the days that followed that Eleanor would keep private in her heart for the rest of her life. Adam had asked her quietly whether she could forgive the concealment, not the marriage nor the rank, but the long winter of half-truths, the mended cuffs and the swept hearth, and the evenings by the fire all lived under a name that was not his true one. He did not excuse it. He laid it before her plainly and let her judge. And Eleanor, who had been lied to and cheated and sold across the whole of her life, and had learned to expect nothing better, found that she could forgive it, and told him why. She had watched him, she told him, across a whole winter, watched the man and not the name, and everything the man had done had been true even when the name was false. He had built her fire when no one was watching to praise him for it. He had slept in the cold and asked nothing. He had put his wages in her keeping and trusted her with them. A man may lie about who he is, she told him, and still be honest in every deed, and she had married the deeds and not the name, and the deeds had never once betrayed her. Adam heard this and was quiet a long while, and when he answered his voice was not quite steady, which she had never heard from him before. He told her that in 2 years of hiding from false friends and true enemies, he had been looking for exactly one thing, a single person who would look at him with the coronet set aside and find the man worth keeping, and that he had walked out of a great house in a plain coat with no real hope of finding it, and that he had found it in the last place in England a duke would think to look, in a cold cottage on a hard moor, in a woman his own father's wrong had brought him to. The debt his father confessed, he told her, he had come north to pay, and instead of paying it, he had been paid, tenfold and past all reckoning, and he did not know what he had done to deserve it, and had stopped asking. For some gifts are too large to be earned, and can only be received with thanks. They settled the matter of the inheritance quietly and lawfully, and it came to more than Eleanor had ever imagined, for her uncle had hidden the true sum for 11 years, and a duke's men were thorough in the finding of it. But the money, when it came, mattered less to her than she had expected, for she had lived without it so long that its arrival changed little in her heart. What mattered was the freedom, and the man and the black cat and the small proof carried now like a warm coal through the rest of her days, that the world could turn kind after so long being cruel, and that a woman need not stop hoping even when hope has cost her everything, for hope had cost her everything, and then, once, unaccountably, paid it all back. But that came later. On the evening of the day her uncle rode away over the white moor and did not come back, there were still only 2 people in a small stone cottage at the edge of a hard parish, a duke who had learned to build a fire, and a woman who had learned, against all her long instruction, to hope. The snow lay deep and quiet over the valley, the fire burned low and warm on the hearth, and a black cat that had wandered in from the cold some weeks before and adopted the cottage as cats do, choosing Eleanor's lap over every other in the house with the unerring judgment of its kind, stretched and turned and settled itself against her as though it had known all along, long before the footman bowed in the lane, that the quiet woman with the cold hands was worth more than the whole county had ever troubled to see. Adam watched the 2 of them by the low light, the woman and the cat that had chosen her, and he thought that the cat had better sense than most of the great world he had left behind, and he was content, more content than the 4th Duke of Ellesmere had ever expected to be, to sit in a small warm room at the edge of nowhere, with the one person who had ever looked at him and seen, not the coronet, but the man. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.